Thank you very much, Esther Gizu. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Let me come to you, Peter. When we go to Africa, the bottom line is that the primary stakeholder is the African citizen. But some will tell you that African citizen is increasingly being treated as if he or she were a subject. Are you concerned about increasing opinion on the continent that elections, at least most of the elections held across the African continent, are not in fact meant for those primary stakeholders, but for development partners?
Well, increasingly, unfortunately, there is this trend. When I first got into Africa, we still had presidents for life. Now, with the solitary exception of Eritrea, everyone holds elections, although, to quote my good friend, Ambassador John Campbell, some of these are more like election-like events rather than elections. And so increasingly, we do have this disparity between the will of the people and what takes place. But I think the most important thing is that we have to look at this in the broader scope, which is increasingly, we do see citizens being empowered either through the ballot box or increasingly through social media and other communications. This isn't your father's or much less your grandfather's generation. And so it's going to be increasingly difficult and challenging for the continent's remaining strongmen to continue to keep their citizens out of the process. And so history is on the side of those who are moving toward reform, but the reform has to come from within. It has to be African agency, and this is where we're with Emira, has to be respected. Because if Africans themselves, ordinary citizens, don't have ownership of the process, it really won't have that legitimacy nor the sustainability.
It's very interesting, Peter, that you point out the exception of Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea out of 54 member countries of the African Union. And yet, frankly, you call the other elections events. You talk about Ethiopia, for example, where someone jokingly referred to Ethiopia as having a perfect democracy because there is not a single member of parliament that comes from the opposition. Everybody is from the ruling party. You talk to Uganda, you talk about Uganda. You just had an election, or an event for that matter. You saw the kind of intimidation, you saw the kind of violence, you saw everything, and you call it an event. You move on to Rwanda, for example, where you have perfect referendum. Is that real?
Well, I think, Shaka, just take one of them, because you've laid out quite a number of things we could talk about. I like to look at a glass half full rather than half empty. In the case of Uganda, we certainly have some serious concerns about the way that election was conducted. But the fact that the ruling party had to put in as many resources to get the result they wanted, and the fact that they lost the cities and had to rely on the countryside to pull things through, that means the next time around it's not going to be that easy. So increasingly, yes, it must be frustrating if you're in the political opposition, et cetera, but you can see the incremental gains. You cannot keep a lid on something that's boiling forever. And I think this is what's happening across the continent at various speeds, et cetera. But I think this is the march of history throughout the continent. Those who try to keep it down are just building up the pressures. And I think that's the key thing to keep our eye on is incrementally we are moving in the direction where it should be going. Do we have reverses? Most certainly. But I think we have to keep an eye on that progress and try to sustain it. And as you often say, keep that hope alive.
Where to go? Now, Emira, as an African, and as an African, of course, in the diaspora, you obviously have observed that you've been on the continent and you have watched elections or selections, some will call them. Do you agree with Peter, especially frankly talking about at least there are some periodic elections taking place? Is that frankly what Africa needs? Aren't you probably better off in Eritrea where there is no pretense of an event? Aren't you probably better off under Libya's brother leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, for 42 years with no pretense of an election, rather than wasting resources, actually trying to please the development partners that you are actually in a democratic process?
No, well, Shaka, I think the issue is, people need control of their own destiny. And so what you have throughout the continent is people clamoring to have a greater say in determining their future. When people see the economy is not working, increasing unemployment, increasing inequality throughout the continent, people are clamoring both for economic and for political change. And it is those clamorings that I believe, they cannot go unheeded. It is particularly young people using music, using technology, using all kinds of ways to express their will. And I see these gains that are happening. Some of it is through the electoral process. Some of it is through people taking to the streets. Look what happened in Burkina Faso. No one imagined that, Blaise Compaoré would be ousted by young people, by musicians taking to the streets, leading demonstrations, demanding change. I think it is that people power, whether it's the students in South Africa that started a fees must fall campaign that has led to this crescendo that is putting such pressure on the ANC, the oldest political party on the African continent, is now being pressured by its standard bearer to be impeached or resign, right? Because of this pressure that came from the bottom up, from young people, from workers, trade unionists. So I think that it is this clamoring that will bring the change. And the clamoring will bring changes not only in electoral processes, but in across the board, in opening up the political space, whether it's through new political parties that will reflect the will of the people, whether it's through new forms of organizing workers combined with farmers and rurals combined with shops, and all of these forces joining hands with students and young people. This is what is I believe, the lesson of history. This is what has brought the end to the colonial period, and this is what I believe will bring the true freedom that's needed both politically and economically on the continent.
Peter said that, for example, in Uganda's last election, the ruling party lost in the urban centers, but it did have support in the rural villages, the rural country. I don't know sometimes why people assume the fact that people in rural areas did not go to school, do not express their opinion, automatically support a dictator.
I think we have to challenge that. I don't think it's an issue of formal schooling. People are incredibly intelligent. They understand the lives that they're living are worse than the lives that their grandparents lived. It's quite simple. They, throughout, whether they have been formally educated or not, know that the system is rigged against them and are clamoring for a way to change that status quo, to change that system so that their children can live better lives. So I don't think we should in any way stigmatize those who are less formally educated. The intelligence is there. People understand in their gut that these demands must be heard. And so I believe it's coming not only from urban centers, but from rural areas. And unfortunately, there have been ways to clamp down on those clamorings. But increasingly, I believe that is the change that the continent and the world needs.
Very interesting. Would you like to react to that?
Yeah, and what I'm referring to is actually just the statistical breakdown of the vote rather than a judgment on rural people. I think part of it is the levers of power in some of these countries. It's a lot easier to clamp down. The use of social media is much less prevalent in rural areas. Local authorities, often apparatchiks of incumbent ruling parties, have greater say over people's lives. And so the pressure points are there. But the point I want to make more broadly is consonant with what Emira said, is the young people, the urban population, you can't hold them down. They're pushing back, and that is going to simply spread and increase. So I think governments now are going to have to not only win these electoral events, but they also have to gain legitimacy. And legitimacy comes from delivering good governance, delivering goods and services that people expect and know to expect.